here in History of Science, and my co-learning professor, David Luft, is right there. And so thank you for coming today for the first lecture in this year's morning series on the material body. We have some exciting events lined up for next year, so I'm just going to go through those very quickly. Our next lecture is on November 21st. There's a poster for it over there, actually, when Nicole Howard of Eastern Oregon University will be talking about women, medicine, and early print culture. And that talk will take place in Special Collections Reading Room at the library. In January, Chris Nichols and I are jointly sponsoring the visit of feminist scholar Natalia Petrozella of the New School, who will tackle the topic of wellness. And upcoming in spring, Corning, with help from the Hundier Endowment and Spring Creek, will sponsor a 2-week residency by artist Lisa Temple Cox, which will include live demonstrations, the construction of a cabinet of curiosities at the cabinet shop Hutch Creek, and a presentation on her in-progress graphic novel on the 16th century anatomy Thessalius. So today I'm delighted to welcome Professor Karen Rader to OSU. Professor Rader is the director of the Science, Technology, and Society program and professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. Her areas of interest are in the intellectual, cultural, and social history of the modern life sciences in the United States. Her PhD is in HPS from Indiana University, go Hoosiers, where she studied with Jim Capshew, who many of us know from his stay here at the Twentieth Century.
He's our guy. We know everything.
Amy would tell you too. Yeah, we have our little Indiana cohort here. She's received numerous grants and fellowships, including from the Mellon Foundation, the Davis Center at Princeton, and the National Science Foundation. She just recently received a rather large NSF grant. And she's also held visiting professorships at the University of Oslo and at the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Lancaster in the UK. Her most recent book, co-authored with Victoria Cain, is Life on Display, Revolutionizing U.S. Museums of Science and Natural History in the 20th Century, which was published by Chicago last year. And it was awarded the 2015 American Educational Research History of Education New Scholars Award. The year before that, she co-edited a book called Animals on Display, The Creaturely in Museum, Zoos, and Natural History, which was published by Penn State. And her first book, Making Mice, Standardizing Animals for American Biomedical Research, 1900-1955, which was published by Princeton in 2004, won a Choice Outstanding Academic Book Award. So I'm really happy that Karen is here today. And her talk today is titled From Watchful Grasshoppers to Rat Basketball. What a great title. Practices of Live Animal Display in 20th Century Science Museums. Please welcome Karen Rader to us.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Anita, for inviting me. I've had a great visit. I'm hoping to come back, maybe do some research in your amazing library. So it's very exciting. So my talk today is going to focus primarily on 20th and a little bit about 21st century U.S. science museums. And I'm going to do 2 things in the talk. First, I'm going to start in the 1950s, and I'll briefly sketch the historical evolution of practices of live animal displays in these museums in order to show how these displays function as a sampling device for particular pedagogies of science learning practiced by display makers and consumed by museum visitors. Second, I'll ask and hopefully answer the so what question. Why does this matter? What makes live animal display a compelling topic for historical analysis? Beyond helping us to understand the history of science education, I want to suggest that live animal displays are also a crucible in which we observe the cultural flexibility of living animal bodies. I will be showing you some examples of how, in these exhibits, animal bodies more often than not are used or interpreted by both exhibit creators and visitors in surprising ways. These interpretations, I want to suggest, reflect ever-present tensions in cultural understandings of particular animals and structural tensions in museum and formal learning. Tensions between understandings of science education and visitor-curator relationships are mediated by the animal subjects that I'm going to talk about. So spoiler alert, the answer to the so what question is, in live animal museum displays, 2 very different elements, animal epistemologies and pedagogical strategies, interact to produce something new and sometimes counterintuitive. As an aside, I've also picked up some case studies to show you today that I hope will draw attention to the diverse sources historians need to use to begin to understand these displays' interpretive flexibility from the perspective of their audiences, as well as their creators. These sources have both advantages and limitations. Basically, the archives, the exhibit reviews, the newspaper coverage when it exists are really great for museum history, but I want to argue they're no longer enough to do the kind of museum history that, that accounts for both visitors and creators. So, there's my university's new slogan, make it real. Hopefully I managed to do that today. Live animals became more prevalent in museums as museum educators sought to change their educational practice, and they wanted to bring education literally more alive, so live animals, but also they focused on using animals to engage visitors in science learning about natural history. This trend emerged against a backdrop of increasingly intense debates both within and between natural history museums and science museums about their changing educational focus, basically catering first to the visitors and their experiences rather than to textbook writers, scientist curators, or school teachers that brought their kids for field trips. By the mid-1950s, administrators and curators at a wide range of institutions, so you're just gonna have to trust me, I won't list them all complained more and more about what they literally called dead exhibits, being a barrier to visitor engagement. So you can notice already from the way that I'm talking that I'm still talking primarily from the kind of curator and creator perspective. We don't have a lot of great evidence about what visitors thought, but you'll see that'll shift over the course of my talk. So Chicago Museum of Science and Industry curator Lucy Nielsen, for instance, issued sober warnings like this about static exhibits and their educational consequences. Too many people believe that museums are numbingly dull, she wrote, and as long as educators and the public at large persist in regarding all museums in this light, they will find their seeds, namely the seeds of education, falling on stony ground. So starting in the late 1940s through the early 1960s, directors like Boston's Bradford Washburn, this is the Boston Museum of Science, argued that new dynamic exhibits would, quote, demand the active participation of visitors in the learning process, unquote. So the live animal displays of these immediate post-war decades then moved beyond the serial arrangements of dead specimens in cases or even dioramas in habitat groups and encouraged visitors to engage with the life on display in the form of participating in curator-led demonstrations. The Boston Museum of Science featured animal events, is what they called them, which encouraged carefully monitored hands-on contact between visitors and live, formerly wild, or at least paradigmatically wild, you'll see why I say that in a minute, animals. Museum education department staffers mediated these interactions. They invited nervous but excited children to touch animals like, up here, this is Heureka and Cuddles. Heureka and Cuddles are two porcupines whose quill release mechanisms have been disabled, so you can all breathe now. And even an owl found as a hatchling and given to the museum to raise, this owl was christened Spooky. So these are pictures of Spooky the owl, which I understand you have a few owls here in Oregon. The Boston Museum used Spooky to publicize its updated museum pedagogy. By the mid-1950s, Spooky had become so popular he was something of an animal celebrity outside the museum's walls, appearing in Look magazine and on NBC's Today Show. Boston area children could even have a Spooky birthday party at the museum, complete with Spooky's presence and a live animal demonstration. Washburn claimed that Spooky represented a new educational success for the museum. First, because it exposed students to natural history, and that's important for this museum because they have a history as a natural history museum, and then they were transformed into a museum of science. So it's kind of resurrecting the natural history past. But secondly, because it mixed that natural history with fun. Natural history wasn't fun before this, apparently. Basically, Washburn, and I'm quoting now, later recalled, the idea was if you mix interactivity with natural history and just simply say, we learn in this place and everything is fun to learn, young people will be interested because they are discovering things, whatever they might be. That's the loosest possible education philosophy you can imagine. Washburn's, so in Life on Display, Victoria Cain and I call this the exposure model. The so-called exposure model was challenged by some policymakers at the time. after the NSF program officers denied him funds to do a summer teachers institute in the museum's galleries with the natural history displays, they told Washburn, now I'm quoting from the National Science Foundation, "Fundamentally, we are interested in instruction rather than exposure to science. We are interested in the real stuff, not the kind of thing that you appear to be doing now." From the visitor perspective, which I think we can capture a little from snippets that are in the newsletter, but also there's a ton of pictures like this picture where people, usually children but not always, are kind of getting up close, trying to figure out if Spooky is dead or alive. Because that's how tame Spooky is. He's been literally raised since he was a hatchling and doesn't react, and so it looks as though he might be a stuffed owl on a pedestal. So I think this kind of encouragement with interactivity was kind of abstract. This question, is it a live animal or a stuffed specimen, mostly seemed to generate staring, not actual interactivity, and puzzling over how tame this owl could be. Perhaps responding to this, as well as to NSF criticisms, Washburn and his staff thereafter argued, mostly in museum newsletters, but also in some letters to donors, that caring for demonstration animals was, to use his perfectly Littorian word, science in action. Such work, such science in action, was now done by a flock of teenage junior assistants, and they allowed these students to get behind the scenes at the museum and learn about the animals while caring for their bodies, that is, doing whatever it took to keep them healthy and happy for museum use. So live animal displays, even this early in the 1950s, begin to reveal the contours of debates over what counted as doing science or learning science in the museum context. By the late 1960s, another model of live animal display, also premised on engaged or interactive learning, emerged in the newly created science centers. This model took science in action to a new level by putting the visitors, as well as the exhibit designers, in the place of scientists. These exhibits took as their nominal subject animal behavior, but they featured animal neurological responses, and they encouraged visitors to explore the meaning of these phenomena by employing more directly experimental methods. So I'm showing physicist Frank Oppenheimer, brother of Robert, here, who founded San Francisco's Exploratorium in 1968 and invested heavily in this approach. The NSF, again, rearing its head, who funded the Exploratorium's first physics exhibits on perception, put significant pressure thereafter on the Exploratorium to include biology in their museum. In 1972, the NSF awarded the museum its second grant, which was used to hire Evelyn Shaw. Evelyn Shaw was a curator at the American Museum of Natural History working with Gladwin Kingsley Noble, if you've read any of Greg Mittman and Erica Milam's stuff on that. And she hired a young Berkeley alum who had a dual background in art and science. Charlie Carlson was a double major in zoology and communication. Throughout the next several years, Shaw and Carlson worked closely together to create interactive displays themed around animal behavior. But these live animal interactives, unlike demonstrations that I described earlier, demanded more than observing or animal petting. Exploratorium life science displays were designed to educate the visitor by giving control of the animal-human interaction to the visitor. For instance, this exhibit was called the Brine Shrimp Ballet, and in its cylindrical tank filled with salt water and illuminated at the top, thousands of brine shrimp fluttered upwards towards the light. When a visitor pushed a switch so that the light shone from the bottom of the tank, the tiny creatures turned in unison, moving downwards toward the new light source. So, kind of ballet. So glad I'm on camera doing that. Exhibit designers believed they were putting a biological phenomenon, phototropism, on display by having visitors interact with, in this way with the brine shrimp. Visitors could observe the initial movements of the shrimp toward the light and watch how they spiraled in different directions. It wasn't quite so smooth as I'm describing it. It was often a little chaotic, but they spiraled in different directions when the light source flipped. We know now from Shaw and Carlson's interviews and archival material that the display did not always work. But Shaw and Carlson took what earlier live animal exhibit designers might have seen as malfunctions, such as broken equipment or unexpected behaviors from both the live animals and the visitors. And anyone who's been to a science museum with a child knows what I mean. And they reframed them as teachable moments. For instance, initially they had believed that the brine shrimp reacted to light wavelengths rather than light intensity, so they installed automatically alternating flashing red and blue lights in the tank. But this psychedelic light show, while popular in 1960s San Francisco, resulted in a profoundly boring display when it came to the animals, because there was very little movement in the brine shrimp. And also it left nothing for the visitors to do. So they replaced the colored lights with white bulbs that changed directions and gave visitors control to push the buttons. Still, once visitors could reliably choreograph the direction of the shrimp, other challenges of animal and human management presented themselves. Younger or irrepressibly fidgety visitors pressed this button so quickly that the brine shrimp in the tank became habituated. So they would sit there and go, da-da-da-da, and then the brine shrimp would just hang out in the middle and do nothing. Upon realizing this, Carlson and Shaw began to rotate new shrimp into the display more regularly. So that also required more time and more attention to the display. As a result of a subsequent relationship that Carlson developed in the mid-1970s with the Grass Foundation, created by the heirs of the Grass Scientific Instrument Maker Company, the exploratorium visitors could also soon play, that was Oppenheimer's word, with an astonishing number of interactive live animal displays. I'm only going to talk about one of these. Perhaps the most remarkable of them, both in terms of its complex design and visitor reactions, was the Watchful Grasshoppers. This is their title. I just stole it from my title. An exhibit that married the Grass family's interests in the nervous system and the exploratorium's experimental approach to life science display. This exhibit implanted, so this is a schematic from a Grass instrument maker letter exchange that I got from the archives in Berkeley. The exhibit implanted wire electrodes into the ventral nerve cord of a grasshopper in order to record its neural impulses that controlled vision. This procedure allowed visitors to explore the grasshopper's visual field to determine what triggered visual impulses in the insect, and to watch how, after repeated stimulation, it too became habituated. So when visitors moved their hand across a plexiglass dome, as you're seeing here, in front of the animal's visual field, they could watch and hear the neural effects of the grasshopper watching them. For this to happen, the exhibit required sensitive instrumentation, of course, provided by the Grass Foundation, an oscilloscope to record and amplify extracellular signals in the grasshopper's nerves, and amplifying speakers. So the oscilloscope was hooked up to speakers that would then click, so visitors could hear, not merely see, the grasshopper's nervous response to stimuli. The Watchful Grasshopper exhibit setup, however, presented challenges far greater than those presented by the brine shrimp. Cystocirca nitens, so S. nitens, the animal subject of this display, also known as the gray bird grasshopper, was an agricultural pest in California. So that meant it was impossible to acquire, to just buy through a commercial breeder grasshoppers, because it was illegal to breed them, forcing staff members into temporary but extremely time-intensive careers in grasshopper husbandry, which I can talk about that in the Q&A. It's pretty long and intense process. Perhaps because this aspect took up so much time, energy, and space, exhibit builders promptly incorporated their newly acquired knowledge of grasshopper husbandry and anatomy into the exhibit. So this wasn't supposed to be a part of the original exhibit, but it became a part. Carlson created a supplementary display explaining the grasshopper life cycle and featuring the museum's grasshopper colony. But by far, the most difficult aspect of this exhibit was that it obliged museum staff to become experts in the frustrating and nascent field of live grasshopper surgery. Carlson basically taught himself how to do this. He read whatever he could on S. nitens. There was basic anatomical knowledge available, conducted his own intensive observations and experiments, and learned how to insert electrodes into their ventral nerve cords, and then had to teach his staff to do the same thing. This required considerable practice. During surgery, the grasshoppers were immobilized with dental wax. Especially hoppy ones were calmed through 10 minutes of refrigeration, and then placed under all of this whole thing went under a dissecting microscope, and the electrode was implanted and then tested. Finally, the preparator used a mixture of beeswax and rosin to cement the electrodes inside the animal. So I'm quoting now from Carlson. If this preparation is carefully made without too much trauma to the animal, it will last 1 week or more, up to a month, without noticeably affecting the behavior or health of the animal. That seems like a long time to me, but the people who had to do this found this irritatingly short, because that meant they had to keep doing grasshopper surgeries. The signage that accompanied the Watchful Grasshopper did not explain the implantation procedure. As with all exploratorium signage, it explains what to do, what to notice, and what's going on. That's how every single display at the exploratorium has that. In ways the designers thought would encourage interaction with the animal to test the scientific principle on display of perception. But though popular with scientists, in fact, the Watchful Grasshopper was used to teach medical students on site, and then also Carlson traveled with a mini version of this to conferences, which I don't even know how he managed to get grasshoppers on a plane, but these displays did not draw the same response from the general public. Never is museum education a kind of one-way process from the curator's mind to the visitor's mind, but it's rare as historians that we have this kind of back and forth documentation of what went on, so I'm going to spend a little time on this. As Oppenheimer had hoped, visitors did draw independent conclusions about science from the museum's life science exhibits, and their conclusions did not always echo those aspired to by the exploratorium. In 1981, for instance, a local teacher lauded the exploratorium as, quote, a wonderful place for making people become aware of and excited by science, unquote. But she also noted that she found the Watchful Grasshopper downright disturbing. So I'm quoting from her again. Whatever the instructional value of such an exhibit, it represents cruelty to animals and only encourages people to treat animals as playthings without feelings. I sincerely hope you will remove that torture chamber. Another visitor in 1983 also noted his discomfort with what he understood as the exhibit's mechanistic setup. Now this is an example where he's misreading the oscilloscope as measuring the animal's fear on a meter, but still he's describing the interaction as counterproductive. He concluded correctly that what is being taught is not, what we learn is not always what people think they are teaching. Rather than conveying information about animal behavior and neurological pathways, he argued, the exhibit's reductionist focus on perception as a phenomenon, rather than the grasshopper as an animal, propagated a reprehensible lesson about human superiority over animals achieved through science. And there's a lot of parentheticals. You would think he was an academic, scientific, genetic, self-defense purposes, but clearly it has to do with science and technology. Extant correspondence shows how Oppenheimer tried often to explain the scientific methods and motivations behind, so I'll leave this while I'm talking about this. He tried to explain. So there was back and forth between Oppenheimer and the people that wrote these things. He also went on local television programs, local radio programs, agreed to be interviewed, and wrote back to a number of these adult visitors who championed animal rights and found these displays suspect. In 1981, for example, he attempted to reassure an angry visitor that grasshoppers in the exhibit weren't receiving visitor-administered electrical shocks. So someone had seen Milgram, I guess. This is quoting from Oppenheimer now. The live grasshopper that you saw was not hooked up to a shock stimulator, many exclamation points. Fine flexible wires were connected to the back of the grasshopper, who lives very happily and can move around. Measurement is very different than torture. So people brought up this word torture a lot. Still, going forward, he promised, quoting again from Oppenheimer, we will do everything we can to make it clear that we are showing that animals as well as people transmit information by generating their own electricity, and that this process is going on in all of us, all of the time. But some visitors committed to the expansion of animal rights were unable to see the relevance of this kind of scientific or philosophical reasoning, and the explicit comparison between animals and humans in the biology displays were not educationally productive. Visitors such as Muhema Start insisted that the exploratorium would never conduct a similar test on a human being, and as a result, the museum's life science displays were fundamentally incompatible with a broader respect for life in all forms. Quoting from her now, my simple point of view is that animals have their own things to do in their natural environment, and that should be respected. Ultimately then, a significant number of exploratorium visitors, first off, a significant number avoided the displays altogether. They did an in-house study in 1975, and Watchful Grasshopper was near the beginning, and only about 5% went in and saw, of the 570,000 or so visitors went in and saw the rest of the exhibit. So they were definitely avoiding the exhibit. But those that saw it concluded from the Watchful Grasshopper that the museum prioritized laboratory manipulation of animal bodies in the name of scientific discovery, even if it was their own scientific discovery, over humane treatment. I think it's notable that an insect, not a mammal or even a popularized sea creature like the sea monkey, brine shrimp, right, generated the largest animal rights pushback in this museum's history. And this is because visitors took from the exhibit that the grasshopper was being set up to act or respond mechanically. And this is where it starts to get kind of complex and contorted, not like what visitors presumed a natural grasshopper, which was hardly a beloved creature, right, an agricultural pest, would act. Jiminy Cricket aside, I know, we can talk about him in the Q&A. So sometime around 1985 to 1987, this negative response was enough for Oppenheimer to declare the experiment a failure and remove the Watchful Grasshopper from the exploratorium's halls. Other classic and replicated live animal exhibits, also had animal rights protesters. But because these protests were more isolated and counterbalanced by positive visitor reactions, these protests were not enough to shut them down. Surprisingly, while the exploratorium's pedagogy attempted to teach animal behavior phenomenon in isolation, live animal exhibits that exhibit designers connected to larger political, social, and cultural contexts seem to have done better, even when sometimes the context itself generated tensions. So for instance, the chick hatchery, clearly the plexiglass dome is enjoying a design era in museum exhibits in the 1960s. The chick hatchery was first put on display in the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry in 1956 as a seasonal Easter addition to its Food for Life exhibit. This I just showed because they're cute. It's a poster I picked up at Easter in 2005. This exhibit, in expanded and updated form, is still on display in Chicago today, now presented in the context of a genetics exhibit in which different varieties of heirloom chickens are described as being preserved by post-factory farming agricultural enterprises. So still food, but now genetics, but now not the genetics that we hate, the genetics that we love. But before that reframing, back in 1998, the United Poultry Concern, so I'm going to call them UPC, they're an advocacy group that describes themselves as campaigning against cruelty to chickens and other domestic fowl, wrote to the Chicago MOSI complaining that the chick hatchery in its Food for Life exhibit, quote, conditioned visitors to view chickens mechanistically by placing them on display in a mechanical setting as they struggle from their shells, end quote. Further, UPC complained the exhibit necessitated an economic arrangement between the museum and the local zoo, in which the museum raised hatched chicks as food for other zoo animals, and that the display deliberately elided this arrangement. So now we're getting into a little bit with the sources. Because I accessed this material from the UPC website 5 years ago, and not in an archive, with a letter exchanged, documented, and preserved, I don't know who from the museum responded, but UPC quoted the response they received from the museum in ways that made clear the museum's official position. The science education in this display was real, or at least their reality of the exhibit, and whoever this was argued that its popularity with visitors proved that any negative treatment of the chickens was not the takeaway message. This reply just kind of elides the whole question of the zoo, right? What actually happens to the chickens once they get taken to the Lincoln Park Zoo. So the chick hatchery's exhibit popularity was replicated in other places in which it was installed, including the Columbus Center of Science and Industry, so that's COSI, Columbus COSI, as it came to be known, which was founded in the mid-1960s and had a chick hatchery in its central exhibit halls from this date. In the case of COSI, we have some evidence of the visitor experience of the live animal display, interestingly obtained via contemporary museum nostalgia websites or blogs. So when COSI closed its location in the deteriorating Memorial Hall building in 1999 and moved to a newly designed building in its current location on West Broad Street in downtown Columbus, the museum opened a blog through which its visitors could share videos sent to the museum to capture what they called the old COSI. And this one is now called the new COSI. Among them was this one, labeled by its creator, who is unknown, 1988 family visit to COSI. And I want us to watch, I'm hoping I can get this to go just with the chick hatchery portion. You're a patient audience. Oh. All right, so here is 1988 museum visit to the chick hatchery. We're only going to watch it a minute. go like this. Sister says keep going. Alright. So the rest is not the chick hatchery. Alright, let's see if I can get my PowerPoint back. So you saw a little bit of kind of how they had it set up. It was different than the original chick hatchery. Go here. This one we won't have to move out of it, so yay. It was, so the interaction I thought that we saw there had really more in common with a pet store or a petting zoo than the earlier demonstration, for instance, in the Watchful Grasshopper, or even some of the earlier setups of the chick hatchery. So now we're staying with the same museum, moving to a different exhibit. Shortly after COSI moved to its new location in 1999, it launched a new live animal display called Rat Basketball. The educational principles of this display harken back to animal demonstrations of the 1950s, but now focusing on teaching a specific psychology of learning, operant conditioning, through demonstration of trained animals using behaviorist principles. In other words, these animals were presented not directly controlled by humans or directly controlled by visitors, but as having already been controlled by humans through their knowledge of psychological science. I think there's some that, you'll see it, you'll see my tape from 2005. So basically what's happening is the rats are taught to put small ping pong sized balls through a hoop via positive behaviors training. They get good rewards for behavior. First they have to be trained, so these are female rats, they have to be trained to stay in the tank without hurting each other or jumping out. Then they have to be trained to climb up on a platform underneath the hoop, and then they have to put the ball through the hoop. And if they don't do these things, they don't get the reward. And if you're wondering what the reward is, it's a tiny piece of Grape Nuts cereal. So the cage is hooked up so that it has these little portals, and the rats do their thing, and then if they do it right, also if they put it in the wrong basket, they don't get a Grape Nut.
Oh, God.
Yeah. As this is a newer exhibit, the combination of visitor reaction and curator vision isn't yet fully visible to the historian, at least not from what I've been able to find. But from what I can find on the web, we know that at least some adult visitors who were parents responded positively to this display, even when they didn't completely engage with the exhibit's scientific content or when they didn't like the museum in which it was located. So, Carrie Miller of suburban Ohio wrote on her mommy blog, Something Special, in March 2010. Did you ever want to see rats play basketball? You can, at COSI in Columbus. Why they taught rats to play basketball, I don't know. But it's a popular show, judging by the crowd Audrey and Elizabeth, the rats attracted today. Our family traveled to the museum. We hadn't been there in 3.5 years, and none of the kids even remembered anything about it. I admit, despite their promotion as being rated by Parents Magazine as #1 science center in the country, my husband and I just don't like this museum, which is why we hadn't been there in 3.5 years. The kids, however, declared the museum so awesome, she put in quotes, and weren't ready to leave after 4 hours and wanted to go back during spring break, and then she put in parentheses, not gonna happen. For me, finding myself strangely into the rat basketball game was the best thing about going to the museum. And so she's kind of captivated by this, but not really learning about it and not really excited about the museum. She does have a little sort of side rant, which I won't quote extensively, but basically it's from the Titanic exhibit. And she was disturbed by the Titanic exhibit, which came to COSI a few months later. And she talks about how in that exhibit you're given a boarding pass, and then when you exit the exhibit, you have to check your boarding pass name against the list to see whether you lived or died.
Oh.
She did not like that. Did you die? Haha, I didn't, right? This is what she's saying. I thought of how a relative might feel if they heard people joking about the fate of their great-grandparents, or press a button making the Titanic split in half and sink. How fun. Or how long can you stand to touch an iceberg that's the same temperature as the water all those people died in? Ho ho, what a ride. You get to walk away when it's too cold. They didn't. So these features, she thought she's described as tacky and tasteless. Some of these features really need to be rethought. So she's disturbed when there's some kind of human component that she thinks is tacky and tasteless, but kind of just thinks the rats are cool, which is interesting. Further, we have, courtesy of YouTube, this film, which may or may not work, as evidence of how child visitors engage with the COSI display, cheering on the rats, encouraged by the demonstrator and their parents, and rooting for their favorites. All right, so I'll show this one at the Science Museum of Virginia. So I'm going to show another one there.
He retired, stopped playing basketball, and lived another year still with us, which is their natural lifespan.
Yep.
And once they retire, though, they usually just refuse to play basketball anymore, so we normally bring them out. We have one rat downstairs who plays for the other side of the red team, but she's retired, so she doesn't come down much anymore. Instead, we just have our blue team rats. And our training rats, a lot of them are going to be red team as well once they're.
So you're seeing the grape nuts. And the one I was going to show you from COSI, there was a lot of little kids yelling, so that was interesting. And you got to hear that the rats were named in that case after characters from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So it was Faith versus Buffy. Buffy won. Yeah. And you also got to see that it was located in a more open gallery. So one of the things I was talking about with the Watchful Grasshopper is sometimes it's a challenge to get visitors to go into the biological gallery, so they bring the displays out into the central gallery and just sort of use it as an attention grabber there without forcing them to go into a gallery. So full disclosure, I became interested in rat basketball in 2010 when I first saw it staged as part of a March Madness promotion for the then rising VCU Rams basketball team, or as they called it, March Ratness Final Fur. Really, I'm not making this up. In 2012, Richmond's local PBS science education initiative called Science Matters mounted, so I think I might be able to find this one. All right. They mounted a 3-minute video about this on its website, featuring the rat trainer Laura Kramer. In the video, she calls herself the Chief Rat Wrangler. This video features an extensive explanation of the behavior science underlying her training methods, along with a demonstration of female rats now named after famous women in science. So Ada Lovelace, and Florence named after Florence Goodenough, one of the PhD students of Lewis Terman, the intelligence tester. So the female rats do the same thing that you just saw there, and that's different than what COSI did. COSI had them just putting the ball in. These rats at the Science Museum of Virginia, she describes them as body slamming themselves through the hoop. And in the video that the Science Museum did, you can also begin to see the audience, which is more diverse. The disadvantage of the videos that are so focused on the display is that you can't really tell what's going on around the display. You can't really tell who's coming. But they're also incorporating an element of this that's meant to show that it's going to teach something about psychology and its history. All right, so I think now I can go back to my presentation safely. Down here, yeah, okay. Rat basketball in Richmond has, I don't know how else to characterize it because I don't know if it's vast, but it definitely has a detectable social media presence, which is more difficult to read the meaning of in terms of visitor reactions. So in this one, the caption says, rat basketball, pretty funny, like kids, traders, in parentheses, chasing treats, done by an adult and thinking that it's funny because of the human analogies. Then we have a bunch of tweets. So this one is from a women's basketball player at VCU. VCU won rat basketball, good luck, I'll take it. This is about a Valentine's Day visit to the Science Museum in which rat basketball plays a romantic part. And then we have several like this, rat basketball. Yes, I was thrilled, hashtag rats, hashtag pet, hashtag Brooksish, Science Museum of Virginia, and then it links to a picture that looks very much like the one you saw in the Instagram picture. But you can begin to see some of the people that are going, and there's a diversity there. Not all school groups, these are adults, and this looks like a younger person. You can click on their profile links, but sometimes not get all the information. So I was going to show you this video of me watching rat basketball in November 2015. It's a one-on-one game between Lillian, named after industrial psychologist Lillian Gilbreth, and Anna, so it could be Anna Freud or the Anna of Freud's work. While the demonstration is in process, the demonstrator, rat trainer Noah Hayden, goes to some length to emphasize the analogies with the human basketball game. In a press release issued in April 2015, Mr. Hayden talked about the mutual enjoyment of the human spectators and the rat players. Quote, "We use classical and operant conditioning techniques to enable our rodent friends the ability to enjoy the game of basketball, and we enjoy watching them too." I was able to interview Noah Hayden, and from talking with him, I can tell you nothing substitutes from firsthand experience because we learn about how the museum handlers handle the animals and match that onto education, and we also learn about how their vision sometimes differs from what we're seeing on the social media response. So when I interviewed him, he mentioned that when rat wrangling became his gig at the Science Museum, this happened after he worked as a conductor, which is what they call, the museum is in a train station, so that's what they call their educational floor volunteers. He was a conductor at the museum during high school. He was put fully in charge of the rat colony and made a decision to retrain the rats to play basketball the same as it was done at the original COSI, with the ball, not the rat, going through the hoop. He said he did this because he thought that when the rats went through the hoop with the ball, two things happened that worked against the museum's educational goals. First, it broke for visitors the strong analogy between rats and humans, because that isn't how humans play basketball, by body slamming themselves through the hoop. So if rats are going to do a human activity, they had better do it as humanly as possible. Secondly, he thought having the rat go through with the ball destroyed visitors' inherent human engagement because it made the game non-competitive. So they were less likely to steal the ball from one another, and he thought that that would sort of increase engagement if there could be stealing like in a real human one-on-one game. So to summarize my arguments, the animal subjects of these displays mediate shifting tensions between museum pedagogical visions and visitor beastly imaginations. And historical study in the practice of live animal displays draws attention to these contours of these tensions, draws attention to these contours of the debate. The Watchful Grasshopper creators wanted museum visitors to do the carefully constructed animal manipulation to learn about perception. Visitors profess to know, regardless of signage or setup, that the animal immobilized under plexiglass is more than its perception, and so they conceive of participating in the educational experiment as cruel. Similarly, visitors, when watching rats playing basketball, Freudian slip, chick hatchlings, rats playing basketball, and owls attending birthday parties, visitors want them all to be what they think of as real animals. More fuzzy, less machine-like, petable, so they can pet them but also be kept as pets, and unstuffed. Yet the reality constructed by the displays themselves often hews so tightly to the human scientific notions they were meant to teach that display creators look for ways to humanize their animal subjects, make rat basketball more human, turn Spooky into a feathery Kim Kardashian. I want to end with this. So this is I don't read Finnish, but thanks to Google Translator, I can tell you that this says rat basketball. The rats are playing basketball on a daily basis. And it's from the Heureka Museum in Finland, where they copied the display from COSI, and it's wildly popular. I just want to conclude that we historians need to sort of encourage scholars employing other disciplinary tools. This would be anthropology, sociology, and education researchers to pay attention and kind of record some of this stuff that I'm capturing through interviews or that might be on social media, because we need this stuff for the future, and it's not going to be preserved. Tweets are cataloged by the Library of Science, but by the Library of Congress, but it's not going to, much of this stuff is not going to be preserved because it's in the kind of human interaction and discussing the exhibits, that we can understand both the education and the animals in the museum beyond what appears in traditional archives. So thank you very much for enduring my technical glitches.